afternoon. I'm Karen Brocious, the director of the Columbia Museum of Art, and welcome to the opening day of REMIX, Themes and Variations in African-American Art. I'd like to begin by thanking all of our generous sponsors of REMIX, including title sponsor Blue Cross Blue Shield and foundation sponsor the Henry Luce Foundation of New York. We also received a major grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and our supporting sponsors, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, U.S. Trust, and our dear friends Susan Thorpe and John Baines. But we also are grateful for the support from all of you, our individual sponsors, our members, and we couldn't do this extraordinary exhibition without you. I'd like to give you a little bit of history about the Columbia Museums of Art's background and commitment to African American art. We have presented dozens of exhibitions for the past 40 years that featured art by African Americans, but none has been this extensive and this important as REMIX. We're actually the first museum in America to explore this theme that African American artists have taken their inspiration from images and stories and styles of the past and remade them into their very own with their own unique perspective. We have already won these important national foundation awards, and I think the media and the local community is really going to be excited about this. And in fact, I wanted to show you the issue of the Free Times this week. It's the cover story. And be sure to pick it up. It really tells the story of this exhibition, the genesis, and the impact that we hope to have. So please pick this up. Also, admission to the museum today and the rest of the weekend is our present to you. We are open free to citizens of City of Columbia and Richland County for the entire weekend because we think this exhibition is so important and special. We want word of mouth to travel and travel fast. So please tell all of your friends the museum's free all weekend and come and see this extraordinary exhibition. We have a special guest with us today that's going to give a special proclamation, but before I introduce her, I would also like to recognize State Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter. Would she kindly raise her hand wherever there she is. Thank you, Representative Hunter, for coming today. We so appreciate your presence. Well, today, one of our most beloved county councilwomen, the Honorable Joyce Dickerson. Joyce, would you come up to the stage, please? Has kindly agreed to issue a special proclamation from Richland County in recognition of the extraordinary achievements and contributions of African American artists to the county, to our state, and well beyond. To tell you a little bit about Joyce Dickerson, she's currently serving in her third term representing District 2, which is Blythewood and Northeast Richland County, on County Council. She is a passionate advocate for the arts, libraries, for recreation, and schools. She is a leader both in our county, in our state, and nationally, and we are honored to call her a true friend of the Columbia Museum of Art. Please welcome Joyce Dickerson.
Thank you, Karen. I can't wait to hear it. Oh, wow. Well, good afternoon. Most of you know I'm not very much of a morning person. I really don't like to come downtown because I like to have valet parking. Don't like to walk. But anyhow, it is my esteemed pleasure to be here this afternoon with you all to give you this proclamation from the state of South Carolina and Richland County, a proclamation celebrating the exhibits, REMIX, themes, and the variation in African American art at the Columbia Museum of Arts. Whereas the Columbia Museum of Arts understand and recognize the beauty and strength of culture, diversity, and the incredible impact it has when it is interwoven for the common purpose. And the museum has been committed to exhibiting African American art and artist heritage over the past 4 decades. Whereas the museum currently collects and includes works for more than over 30 African American artists, including, now I'm gonna show you something. This is like in font 10, and I'm used to font 16. But anyhow, I'm gonna do my best. And it says, whereas the museum currently collects and includes works by more than 30 African American artists, including Romaine Bearden, John Biggers, Bo Cannon, and also Elizabeth Cutlett. William H. Johnson, Bet Starr, Leon Twigs, Carrie Mae Ween, and many others. Whereas on February the 5th, 2016 through May the 3rd, 2016, the museum will celebrate the achievements and the contributions of African Americans with a special edition called REMIX, Theme and Variation in the African Americans Art. Whereas this exhibit has already won 3 significant national grant awards, including those from Henry Lou Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Elizabeth Firestone Graham Foundation. And whereas REMIX is comprised of paintings, sculptures, mixed media, where artists remake images, and a new work of arts is created that carries familiarity and older meaning forward. REMIX is the familiar that gives the past experience and fresh context and allows viewers to see the remix past through the eyes of the artist's own experience. Whereas REMIX promises to be a vibrant culture and community experience where creativity is enjoyed, discussed, and added to our ongoing conversation about American life. Now, therefore, be it proclaimed that Councilwoman Joyce Dickerson, that's yours truly, District 2, along with Richland County Council, would like to recognize the Columbia Museum of Arts for the many contributions to our community and to our county, encouraging all Richland County residents to visit the museum February the 5th through May the 3rd, 2016, and experience the REMIX theme and variation of African American culture. And that is proclaimed today by Councilwoman Joyce Dickerson, our Chair Tory Rush, and also our clerk, Monique McDaniels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is beautiful.
That's font 10. Thank you so much.
This is so beautiful. Thank you, Joyce.
You're welcome.
Get my notes. We are very blessed to have artists with us today. May I ask the artists that are in the exhibition to please stand up and be recognized by our audience? The exhibition is made possible by the extraordinary staff of the Columbia Museum of Art. Would you also please stand up and be recognized? And special thanks, of course, go to our chief curator, Will South, whose idea to create REMIX is an extraordinary one for us all, and we are very grateful for his creativity and his curiosity in bringing it to life. So thank you, Will. Now for the good part. I'd like to introduce our beautiful consultant, independent curator, and extraordinary educator, Jonell Logan. She specializes in contemporary American art, and she has worked on the staff of the Harvey B. Gnatt Center for African-American Art and Culture in Charlotte, the Gibbes Museum in Charleston, the Studio Museum of Harlem, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. She has also taught on the faculty of the College of Charleston and the Art Institute of Charlotte. Her specialties are drawing and printmaking, so she's an artist herself. She played a vital role in the development of the REMIX exhibition by writing the introduction essay. And I'm just going to step aside one more time and show you this beautiful catalog. Jonell's essay is in this catalog. Will has a terrific essay in here. Every work in the exhibition is featured in color, and it tells you the story of this exhibition. So please take a look at this in the museum shop. We want to thank Jonell for being here today. Joelle Ryan Cook, where are you? There's Joelle. Joelle's our deputy director, and Joelle is incredible, and so Jonell and Joelle are partners in crime. We want to thank Jonell Logan for being here today, and her husband, Juan Logan, is in the exhibition. And she's going to give us her insights into the themes that shape this show and the modern contemporary trends in art today. So with that, please welcome Jonell Logan.
So I'm really glad you guys are here. I do have a housekeeping kind of disclaimer. So the technology, as you may know, if you shift from one platform to another, can get a little janky. And so some of the videos I plan to show you today, I won't be able to. But I'll give you a reference for them if you want to check them out. I invite you to. It's really kind of interesting. So I'm really excited to talk about the REMIX exhibition on a number of levels, but to really talk about some of the questions that I've experienced when people kind of talk about the show. Now, all of you have seen the show? Yes? Maybe? Show me your hands if you have. Awesome. If you haven't, for the few people who have not, I encourage you after the conversation that we have to go into the galleries and take a look at the work, because it's impossible in the amount of time that we have to really have an in-depth conversation about the work, all of the work. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to reference all the artists in the conversation. But the great thing is you have the catalog, you have the video, you have the portable kind of tour that you can do, and the work is right next door. So you really need to explore all of those, and it'll provide a fuller picture of the exhibition. So, exploring REMIX. So, what is REMIX? It is an exhibition that explores the work of African-American art and artists of African descent, and that's something that's incredibly important when we think about language. We're not just talking about people of color that were born here. We're looking at artists, including Renee Cox, who have a larger kind of cultural identity. So we're looking at artists of the African diaspora. We'll look at artwork that reinterprets subjects, reclaims and represents stereotypes and symbols, and repurposes objects. And again, it's critically important. This is one exhibition in a larger history of exhibitions, but also it encompasses a portion of what artists of the diaspora create. And so it's really important for me to encourage you to think about that. This is not an all-inclusive, all-expansive conversation about Black art. This is an opportunity to look at what some artists are doing and then connect that to a larger creative process. So, and it's funny, so there are two questions that I constantly have about the show that I've received over the couple of days or weeks. So what's the difference between remix and appropriation, right? Because in conversation with someone, they actually said, oh, these artists are appropriating European art. I said, no, that's not true, and we'll talk about that. And then also, why is a distinction so important? So we'll look at those two ideas and then talk about why. So right now, unfortunately, if you pay attention, the face of appropriation in current culture is Beyonce. Beyonce made this song with Coldplay, right, this group, and she clearly is dressed up like someone from, where? India, right? And I say dressed up for a reason, right? A lot of the critical conversation comes out of the music video that was shot. The song is called Hymn for the Weekend. So it's like your typical, you know, I'm in love, get drunk, I feel kind of hot, right? It's this like general feel-good song. So what Coldplay did was to record the video in India, in and around Mumbai. And there's Coldplay, right, having a good time. And you have kids dressed up like Vishnu and floating gurus and people dressed up like Hanuman, like another deity. You have Holi, right? If you know color runs in the United States, they're based off of that, which is actually a religious holiday, right? That does not happen all of the time, and that's one of the criticisms about the video, because when you look at kind of Western perspectives on India, you always see this very colorful, like people are just throwing color at each other all the time, every day, for no reason. And then Beyonce, who can generally do no wrong, but is being questioned right now because she appears in tribal dress In one scene, she appears as a deity in another. And the criticism is, right, and why this is appropriation, because one, Coldplay and Beyonce are not Indian, which is fine, right? But then there's also no context. Nothing about the song has anything to do with India. And if you read a lot of the criticism, it's also looking at this idea of the Western notion of what India is. So they'll have, and I watched the video to prepare for this, right? And also I was curious to see what people were like complaining about. That when they show like this movie scene, like they're going to the movies, it's this old reel-to-reel kind of film, and like the guy is like manually putting it on. When Bollywood, in reality, in 2016, is a multi-billion-dollar business that rivals Hollywood. And so this idea of this very romantic, very old, right, other India is something that they capitalize on. That's the root of appropriation. You don't attempt to understand the culture, you're not a part of the culture, and you borrow elements of it to suit your needs, right, without this investment in understanding. In contrast, this would be a video here, right? Remix. So I was trying to think about like what for me was like the epitome of remix. And we think about it in music all the time. Like you hear this is a remix on so many songs at this point. And I thought about, doing, what's that guy's name? Vanilla Ice, right? The standard, right? In honor of David Bowie's passing, right? He sampled Under Pressure and lost, right? He got sued for copyright. And then I thought about Blurred Lines, another moment where a song was sampled, borrowed from, and they didn't quite remake it enough, and they lost. But then I thought about this, I'm about to date myself. I grew up in New York. Have you guys ever seen this image before? Okay, in New York in the late 80s, early 90s, right? There was this public service announcement. Before they had safety bottles on medicine, kids could just open it and take it. So this company put out this PSA, and these pills are spilled out of a bottle, right? Those are the pills. They're actually puppets, and there's a bottle on the side. And they tell you, the whole idea is they tell kids that it's not healthy to mess with these. And so they sing a song, and they say, this is serious. We will make you delirious. You should have a healthy fear of us, because too much of us is dangerous. I would have showed you the video, but, So fast forward to 1998, Busta Rhymes, a New York native. See, look, she's like, oh yeah, right? So Busta Rhymes sampled this. He took the same lyrics and made it into his song, Dangerous. Now, what's interesting about it, so in the first case, it's a benevolent ad, right? It's telling kids, we are so not safe for you, don't mess with us. We look like candy, right? But no. Busta Rhymes is talking about the Flip Mode Squad, which is his crew, right? And in a different context saying, this is serious, we will make you delirious, right? So the idea of danger is present. He has a full understanding. He grew up in New York. He understands, in the New York area, he understands the dynamics. But it's taking that same very familiar message, right, with a similar context and repurposing it to talk about the dangers of messing with him and his crew. It's a great song. It's not necessarily, there's radio versions and non-radio version. I encourage you to check it out. And so for me, this really, in a moment, epitomized the idea of remixing. So you're taking something that you're familiar with, right? You're not completely deconstructing the notion of what it's about, but transforming it, rewrapping it so that it can actually speak to issues or ideas that are important to you. And that's a lot of what's happening in the exhibition. So what does that look like in art? So this is Picasso. Everyone's seeing this, right? Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And we talk about, in the context of art history, this being one of those moments, a critical moment, where an artist has changed his style, being inspired by other art. And in this case, African art. And this is an example, excuse me. This is a mask from, I think this one is from Zimbabwe, or Zaire, and that's an example of the work that's the figure seated on this is the right-hand side. So when we talk about appropriation, we can talk about Picasso. Because while he was looking at African art, he was looking at it totally formally. He pulled out any spiritual context. He removed the cultural context. He's just looking at it as a way of making work, okay? In contrast, still looking at African art, this is an Nkisi power figure. These are traditional African sculptures. They are seen as spiritual, as living. You drive elements of metal into it to not only pay reverence, but then also as a kind of offering, right, and asking. And if we look at the work of Renee Stout, who's in the exhibition, we see a very different way of approaching and using and remixing this aesthetic. Renee Stout is an American artist, but she's also a practitioner of hoodoo. If you think of Santeria, hoodoo, voodoo, these are all African-derived religions in the Americas. The religion came from Africa via slavery and was practiced and continues to be practiced in various ways, initially in hiding, but then now very much in public, even though there's still this element of stigma that exists around it. But it's a living, practiced religion, and Renee talks about that. She practices it. She integrates her reality into artwork. And so there's this very different approach. One more. This is Stefano Maderno's Saint Cecilia. This was created in 1600. Does anyone know about Saint Cecilia? Okay. So Saint Cecilia, she's a saint, right? We can start there. And the story is she was a Roman, a woman of, not royal, but what's the word I'm looking for? Yes, noble, thank you, birth. She was a virgin, and in the time of Christianity, she was converting. And so she pledged to remain a virgin in honor of God. Now, when you look at stories like Lilith and other women who've chosen to remain virgins, they become this kind of feminist narrative, right? Because the way that people will control you is by marrying you off. So you were the property of your father, and then you became the property of your husband. And so she, in her religious kind of glory and worship, decided to remain a virgin. So much so, her father married her off. You know, she sang this beautiful song at her wedding that pledged her virginity to God. Her husband was like, okay. You know, went saw the angel where she said she would find them, et cetera. And ultimately, she was killed for her position, who she was and her position. Now, we see this here. How does that change the image? This is a painting by Kehinde Wiley, who's in the exhibition. This is not the painting that's in there. But what does that say? Visually, what is the impact? We still have this martyr, but instead of it being a woman who sacrificed herself for God, right, or her virginity or religion, we have this idea of people, black men, who become martyrs every day for who they are. And so it's a very interesting sense of understanding and ownership. And when we think about how Kehinde Wiley was trained, just like all the other artists in this show, right? You are classically trained, you're traditionally trained, which means you study this work, the original work, the work that we saw before this. You learn about the old masters. You understand painting and tradition. If you look at his work, right, it's this very kind of hyper-realistic, and if you look at the range of his work, there's clearly references to European painting constantly in terms of composition, in color, et cetera, in painting practice. But what he's doing is using that language that he is taught, and all of these artists are taught in a Western perspective, to have conversations about their experiences. And that is why this is not appropriation. And it's interesting, if you look at and talk about Kehinde's work and read about his work, not only is he looking at this kind of visually, and he's talking about sacrifice, he also is very aware of the history of Christianity in Africa and what impact that has, and what impact Christianity has had on people of color around the world. So there are these larger conversations that can happen when you're looking at this artwork. And these artists are conscious in making decisions on how to use this language. So big things before we look at some of the artwork. Other artists, or artwork of other artists, artists of the African diaspora are not borrowing from another culture. We're not. We are of the culture. We sit next to the same people in school, right? All of us sat together in school. We receive the same history. If you're an artist, you are trained the same way. We are not other. We are all a part of this. And the choice is to then take this language that is learned and have a larger conversation to build a bigger narrative. And that's what this work is about. And the sense of ownership is because of the master narrative. Have you guys heard of that expression before, the master narrative? Now this is where a video would have been, right? Insert video here. You can Google this, and it's on YouTube. Toni Morrison and Bill Moyer talk about the master narrative. And so in summary, the idea is the master narrative is that overarching storyline that we receive, right? It's based in Europe. It's linear. And if you look at the way that people look at history around the world, it's not necessarily linear, right? So it's this linear history that's rooted in Europe and directly affects the United States. And it's a narrative that is created by people in power, okay? Now, the way that it manifests here, one way that it's taught is in school. How many of you have seen the Dick and Jane books before, right? So they were books that were created from 1930s. They were popular from the 1930s to the 1970s. And they were books that helped kids learn how to read. And so you had Dick and Jane, right? You remember some of these? And Father and Mother, and then there was Sally, the little sister, and then they had a dog named Spot, of course, and a cat. I forget the cat's name. Everybody forgets the cat. Thank Puff. Okay, thank you. See, Puff. See, Spot, right? And it's this nuclear like it's the ideal family. And I remember seeing those books, right, and reading them. And what happens is it's a wonderful way of looking at how the narrative is presented, right? We see it in kids' books, but it's this larger thing. Again, when we look at art history, right, the narrative is written from a Western perspective. And how many of you have ever seen like Gardner's art history book, any of those like big tomes of art history? If you notice, right, so we kind of go from, when we start, I think we start in the Middle East, you start at Lascaux with the cave paintings, right? So we're in France and we're in Europe, and then we kind of go into the Middle East for a moment, and then we come back. And when you get to the section about the other, you have Africa, Oceania, the Americas, period, right? Japan, a little bit of Asia, the rest of Asia, crammed into a section that, I kid you not, is about this big in a book that is this big, right? So the idea that you can just compress an entire collection of nations into a section this big in this larger book is incredible, right? And when you're learning about art making, we look at the old masters, and those old masters tend to be from Italy and France. I mean, still today, right, when you graduate from college, you don't backpack through, I don't know, like Colombia, as in the country, not in the city, right? You still go to Europe. You backpack, I'm going to backpack through Europe, right? That's the epitome. So this idea that this narrative is defining who, as a nation, as a collective, and even sometimes as a planet, because colonialism spanned the planet, people are. And that becomes the benchmark for how people see themselves. And so if you remember, have you all ever seen this image? So this is the Clark experiment. It was in 1939. It was Dr. Kenneth Clark and his wife. They did this experiment where they had black children and had a white doll and a black doll, and they said, okay, which one is the smart one? Which one is the bad one, right? Et cetera. Which one is the beautiful one or the pretty one? Generally, in over half of the cases, and I forget, it's like 69%, all those kind of numbers, the white doll was associated with beauty, with intelligence, and everything that was positive. And these are black children. Black dolls were ugly and bad and uneducated. And we can kind of trump that up to a moment, but there's Anderson Cooper, one of my many crushes. Sorry, honey. And, right? So they redid the study recently. You can tell, right? There's Anderson, and he's kind of hanging out with these kids, and the same results took place. And when Toni Morrison talks about the master narrative, she actually talks about the book, The Bluest Eye. And in that book, Pecola, who is one of the primary characters, is this black girl who would die, literally, mentally, for blue eyes. Because for her, and she's it's a long and very heavy story, but the idea is that for her, worth meant to have blue eyes, right? Because of all the narrative. And so one of the ways that the artists in this exhibition are playing is reworking that master narrative, right? Because it's exclusionary, a lot of the artists are reinserting themselves into that narrative by manipulating or working with images that have already been kind of sanctioned by the establishment. So this is Sandro Botticelli's Primavera, the painting, right? Botticelli was a Renaissance painter, a little bit, risque in his work. But if you look at it, it's kind of your traditional Renaissance. By the way, Renaissance painters were remixing too. If you kind of look at their work and recall, right? They're looking at the past, the Greek and Roman myths, right? They're kind of reinterpreting that and kind of pushing Catholicism a little bit, right? So you have, this image basically of spring. You have the various deities. She's in the center, by the way. If you look at her and you look at images of Mary, right, with the red cloak, and the pose is very similar, and the arch of heaven above her, right? But what we're going to do is to look at the three graces on that side of the painting. The three graces are three deities that in Greek and Roman mythology were symbols of beauty and grace, right? They were the ideal women. Women who were frequently looked at as objects of consumption, right? They were passively beautiful, but ideally European. So what does it mean when Mickalene Thomas takes that same pose and the notion of the three graces and transforms it into women that look like her, right? Women who embrace natural hair, right? Have you seen the painting? Women who also occupy an incredible amount of real estate on a wall, okay? So looking at her experience, kind of this idea of shine, this idea of these really kind of ideal women within kind of Black mythology, how does that change these notions of beauty? How does it represent to all of us this concept of what we value? And for Pecola, who would totally could not see herself as beautiful, and the children in the Clark study and a lot of young women, how does that change their narrative and their understanding of what it means to be beautiful? All right, Fahamu's here, hey. So we have, and this is the banner image for the exhibition, right? Norman Rockwell meets Fahamu. So on this side, you have the triple self-portrait, and you have Norman Rockwell. I walk around a lot, so I'm holding on to this thing so I don't roam, so you can hear me. Right, so in that, Norman Rockwell is painting a portrait of himself. If you look at the objects kind of around him, there's his painting can, the trash can on the side, and there's this great story about how, because some of the stuff is flammable if you leave it in there and combine, he would leave stuff in there, so you have these wisps of smoke coming up because that's totally what it would look like in his studio, right? But then he's painting himself, and he has his heroes, including Rembrandt and Van Gogh, kind of pinned up on the side of the canvas that he's working on. And Norman Rockwell, if we think about it, he is kind of a symbol of Americana, right? Everybody knows Rockwell's images. Coca-Cola remixed his images to sell their soda, and it's an image that we see over and over again. We're familiar with his work. It's become a symbol of popular culture as well as artistic practice. And he was a regionalist, so this idea of painting what you know was important. And then you have Fahamu. It's funny to talk about you and you sitting right here. Yeah, thank you. Hold your ears, right? But what's interesting is then for Fahamu and other artists to take that narrative, right? So instead of, Fahamu's painting himself, right? His icons and heroes are on the top as well, right? So you have Muhammad Ali, Basquiat, and Andy Warhol, right? So this whole idea already playing with like, who are ideal figures, but then also playing with this idea of pop culture and inserting yourself again into that space. And there's a power in inserting yourself into a history and a narrative that has historically and purposefully excluded you from the conversation. And so when we look at some of these works of art, the idea of taking images that we already know and are familiar with the language of what they're supposed to mean and shifting that conversation is something that's incredibly powerful because it doesn't require a lot of conversation for you to initially get it. But there's a lot happening behind the image, beyond that space. Another artist, William H. Johnson. This is David and Goliath. For me, this one was interesting because I think Will and I were talking about it, and I have this, because I like contemporary art, I have this habit of really kind of talking about contemporary artists. And he was like, you didn't talk about anybody who's not contemporary. And I was like, okay, I'll work on that, right? But Johnson is interesting because in this story, this is David and Goliath. And I think the Bible is incredibly important when we talk about the master narrative and talking about controlling, honestly, populations. And so generally speaking, if we think about the Bible, and I'm asking you, if you're religious, to kind of just step outside of the religious box for a moment, and we're looking at it as a historical document, okay? So can we all agree to that just for a moment? Awesome, okay. So if you think about it, the stories that generally have been forced in some cases or kind of interwoven into the Black experience are stories that support the idea of the underdog being victorious in the end, right? Or victory will happen after this lifetime. So this idea that just wait for it and it'll come. Okay? David and Goliath is a story that we've heard constantly, but is also an important part of this kind of conversation. Because what happens is the underdog eventually, right, Goliath is the big guy who kind of picks a fight. And again, we're just coming outside the religious context, right? We're looking at it as a story. And then David, who has faith, is just like, I got this, and ultimately defeats Goliath with one blow, right, to the head. And we've seen it repeatedly done, throughout history, represented throughout history. What's interesting about Johnson's representation is that he's actually inserting people who look like him into the narrative, but then also making it a contemporary image. So the idea is that these guys are kind of dressed in sports gear, right, that are familiar to Johnson. The other reason why I wanted to show this image, and this is a slight aside, when Johnson is painting, this is a conscious style. He's looking back at the idea of the untrained artist, looking at the primitive, quote unquote, and I use that big, quote unquote, primitive artists who were self-taught, with this idea of trying to look at the authentic and reclaim the Black experience. So a lot of African-American artists were not trained, classically trained. There were those, and there continue to be those that are, but others that were not. And so, in part of this kind of new Negro identity and looking at this history, he's choosing to paint this way because, like other artists, Johnson went to Europe. He was traditionally trained, right? You can see all of these amazing landscapes that he painted while he was across the pond. This is a conscious choice for him in the style of work. So when you look at his work, I want you to think about that and to be conscious of this choice that he's making, okay? And I know I have to hurry up. I have to pay attention to time. So stereotypes and symbols is another way that this exhibition talks about the idea of reclaiming. And this one can be touchy, right? But that's fine. We're all grown and we can work together to talk about this. So the first image I have is Glenn Ligon's Runaways. Have you all ever seen ads like this before? Okay, so historically, when slaves ran away, there would be these basically advertisements where they would provide this description of the slave, right? And so what's interesting about this series of work, and I think there are 4 or 6 in the space across the way, Glenn writes about himself. So one, what does it mean to write about yourself in this context, right? So Glenn is 5'8", very short hair, cut nearly completely shaved, stocky build, 155 to 165 pounds, et cetera, right? The challenge, of course, with those descriptions is that it can define a whole lot of people, right? So it's this very kind of general description that not only talks about the value of a person or how we see them, but also how they identify. And it's very relevant today when we talk about and hear about cases where people have been stopped because you fit the description. That conversation continues every day around the country because you fit the description. Well, what is this description? It's this very kind of general description. So looking back at this history, making these elements personal, because this is a stereotype, right? We've heard the saying, everybody looks alike. It's playing and taking layers off of that, because when you think about Glenn and people who know him, or even the idea that this artist is choosing to define himself in that way, what problems does it, kind of highlight? What are these challenges? Colin isn't here today. He was here yesterday. So this one is really funny. Colin Kwashi has this amazing sense of humor. But he's dealing with the issue in reclaiming and representing the concept of the plantation, okay? Colin's based in Charleston, South Carolina. And, there's plantation. There are a lot of communities that are built with the name plantation in it. So already, that's an issue of how you identify and why is that okay. But then what he did was to take this game of Monopoly and recontextualize it in the history of slavery. And unfortunately, you guys can't play it. I've seen it installed where you can play with it. But what he's done is to take the different, okay, I gotta walk. Is it okay? Drew, can I get off of this for a minute? Thank you. Because he was recording it, I wanted to make sure I didn't go away. So what he does is to change, these are the Underground Railroad, so the railroad cars, right? They become the Underground Railroad. There's chants and Confederate chest instead of the community chest, right? The characters that you kind of move around the board all kind of reference slavery. The Free State, right? Instead of it being, you see the Free State up there, right? So what he does is to kind of claim the board and actually make these clear references to the history of slavery and its continued presence, right? And actually highlights the fact that this was all about money making, right? People were commodities. That's what this is about. But he uses his really kind of great sense of humor to talk about these challenging issues that continue to exist today. And again, using something that we're familiar with. Everybody, at some point or another, has either played, if you're good, or endured, if you're bad, Monopoly, right? Now, I'm gonna reference Kwashi's work again. One of the big images that we see a few times in the exhibition is Aunt Jemima. And Aunt Jemima is a really important stereotype. First, she plays off of the housemaid, right? The mammy, who would be in the kitchen, who would help in the big house, who kind of kept everybody in line, whether it's the kids or the slaves, right? She was that one confidant, if we're thinking kind of the stereotype that everyone had. And the image of she's imagined as, and I say imagined as because the real house person would change, right, as individuals change, right? So they didn't all look the same. So she has her kerchief on her head. She has the little white kind of neck thing. And she's always wearing this big skirt, right? So if we imagine Gone with the Wind, her, what's her, see, I always forget her name. Yeah, Mammy, yes. So this is Hattie McDaniels, yes. So this is a collaborative effort, by the way. So here she is, she becomes a symbol. And with Aunt Jemima, what's really, really interesting, she was the first live, kind of not only live model, but this live spokesperson for products in the United States. Her name was Nellie, oh goodness, how did I just forget? I get all weirded out sometimes, Nancy Green. And she actually became in 1893 the face of Aunt Jemima. Now, Aunt Jemima, right, the idea was that you're buying pancakes, okay? And she was in the kitchen, and Happy Days is here, right? You can read all that. And so it was this very safe, very comforting figure that came into your kitchen and brought you homemade pancakes that would please your entire family, right? So the ideal domestic. Aunt Jemima had a facelift later on, all right, because people kind of responded against this stereotyped image. So she lost her head cover, and she wore pearls. Her hair is straight, right, so she has a perm or a relaxer. But she's still very happy. She's still very safe. She's still in your kitchen. Now, this is Colin again. I had to show this one, right? Because what he does is to really play with that concept of who she is, right? She's the one Black woman that was allowed in the house safely, right? She is the comforting figure. And in his opinion, right, who is doing that today? Oprah, right? I gotta tell you, like, really quickly, like, this is how infiltrating Oprah has become. I went and I ordered like a tea at Starbucks. I got a chai. And then when they were calling, you know how they called what you got? They were like, what they say? Oprah something, something. I was like, oh, that's not mine, because I just got a chai tea. I don't know what that is. And it sat there for a while, and they kept calling it. And I was like, is that mine? And this woman next to me, she's like, I think that's yours. But I was like, they said something about Oprah. I didn't order anything for Oprah. And then it turns out that now the tea is Oprah's tea in Starbucks, right? So Oprah's everywhere. You know that Oprah bought Weight Watchers stock, and then all of a sudden the stock like shot up like $1 billion. Like she made an obscene amount of money in 3 days, right? Oprah is the one who gives everybody a car. Oprah is the one that we read her books because they're on her book list, right? We drink her tea. We're now losing weight with Oprah, right? Her favorite things are now our favorite things. And Kwashi kind of plays on that, right? She has become, in his opinion, I keep putting it out there because I want everybody to be like, Oprah, Jonell said. Not that you are going to talk to her, but she has become the face, right, to replace Aunt Jemima. And a couple of other characters, this is Tiger Woods on this end, and Uncle Ben, right, who also is a character, right? He's just kind of playing off of this contemporary idea of who becomes these faces, who are the people that we deem safe, right? Who are these mythological characters? Now, this would be a video, but that's the box, but don't worry about it. Iona Rosio Brown also looks at this idea, right? And this idea of stereotypes. And we're going to talk a little bit about masking. But what she does, she's trained actually in Japanese printmaking as a part of her practice. And she looks at this idea of Japanese art, but then also kind of cultural clashes. So in her work, she's like smashing up geishas with samurai. But then also, you notice the woman is blackface. There is this amazing interest. There's a collective of Japanese people who are really invested and interested in hip hop. So the ideal in Japan is to have very fair skin. These women tan, they wear darker makeup, they put in like hair extensions, all of this to look like what they think Black women look like, right? And frequently they're basing these ideas off of hip hop videos, right? This hip hop culture. And the video that I wanted to show you actually talks a little bit about that. And it's actually shot in Japan and these women kind of talking about it. And what's interesting, when you listen to their language, they're not identifying with Black people, right? And once they're saying, that looks good on them, so I'm gonna do it. Right? So for example, they're like looking at this music video, and this woman clearly is wearing a little bit of clothes in the video. And so she says, it would look vulgar on us, but it looks great on them, right? And the hippest store to work in are stores that sell this hip hop kind of culture, sell it. They're not trying to be Black, they don't want to be Black. but they identify with this style, this aesthetic, this experience. And so what Iona is doing is kind of investigating that through this kind of fusion of artistic style, but then also this element of masking and raising the issue and the question of this kind of presentation of Blackness without the understanding of it. And Beverly McKeever, let me check the time. Beverly McKeever is in the exhibition. This is not the piece that's in the show, but she too talks about it. And one of the things that was great about Beverly's work, in one of the things she was talking about, she talks about when she was a kid, she put this, and I think I've done it, I'm sure some of you have done it. You put the t-shirt on your head, right? So you had the long flowing hair. Has no one done it? Okay, thank you for being honest, thank you, right? So you put the shirt on, right, and you have this long flowing hair, and it's great in the sense of beauty, right? But then knowing that your hair doesn't do that, or knowing that, well, it can do that if you purchase hair or you straighten it, et cetera. Like you go through these great lengths to have that happen. And so part of what Beverly looks at is this whole idea of, as a kid, this, and kind of growing up, this idea of beauty, right, and wanting to mask herself as something else. But then afterwards, this whole idea of really thinking about how we do wear a mask, right? What you present to people is very different from what you actually are underneath, and how people see you, right? What they see of you is very different, potentially, from who you are. And so really playing with this idea of surface and face and presentation and stereotype, right? That history of wearing the mask or blackening your face, the history of blackface. Leo Twigs isn't here today, but Dr. Twigs also is another artist that manipulates concepts of symbols, because blackface really is a symbol, right? It's a notion of what people, and a stereotype, a notion, right? When you put on blackface and you act, it's a concept of how people act or who they are. With Dr. Twigs, he actually does a lot of work with the Confederate flag, which I know is a hot button issue here, but then also looking at the idea of targeting. And I saw this quote, which is why I actually wanted to use these images, and he talks about the idea of the moving target and how Black people have been moving targets historically. And for him, in a moment, when 9/11 happened, it shifted awareness for other people who historically have not been targets, right? So now every American in our consciousness has become a target. And what does that feel like? And what does that look like? And how do we behave now that that's our reality? And I thought this work was really important, or this conversation is really important, because it's very easy to say that Black artists only talk about Black stuff, whatever you define Black stuff to be, right? But it's not, right? It's not true. Black artists talk about the American experience, or the European experience, or the Dominican experience, right? We talk about this larger cultural experience because we are so much a part of that. We are that, right? If we looked at an expansive history and a narrative, we are there at every moment, right? So when we think about 9/11, it wasn't just one population of people that got killed. Everyone did. It was a moment for humanity. And so looking at that and really being conscious about that it's not a Black thing. This show is not a Black thing. Black people are talking about their experience, but it is not limited to just that. And I think that conversation has to leave this building and leave this space in order for people to really understand the work, to appreciate the work, and to begin to shift our own kind of notion of what art is, what culture is, and what the narrative is. And then quickly, I need a time check. Is there a time check? I can go on forever? Okay, what time do I have to stop? When you would like to. Yes, we will be here all day. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so real quick, oh look, a little formatting issue. So a couple things. So in repurposing objects, and that was a conversation that Will and I had, and Victoria and I had, and kind of talking about this notion of object, right? And talking with other people, the issue was, or it was interesting, someone said, oh, well, you know, artists can't always afford materials, so they just kind of use whatever they can in the context of the show. And I was like, well, no, That's not necessarily the case. There's this long history of artists using materials that are not considered traditional art-making materials for a reason and on purpose, right? And we accept them. So Marcel Duchamp, right, and that's bicycle wheel. People are familiar when he used the urinal, right, fountain. Robert Rauschenberg in the center, that's actually a stuffed goat inside a tire, right, on top of a pallet. And David Hammond's, one of my all-time favorites, thank you, right, who's using, you have kind of chandeliers and this crystal that's used to create the basketball hoop. So question, this kind of combining and contrasting material and the idea, et cetera. So, sorry, let me go back. Come on. Oh, wait. So Michaela, who's here, Pilar Brown, right, uses photography, herself, and object to talk about issues of identity, of feminism, of voice, and beauty, okay? So and it's important to think about this kind of larger relationship between object and artist. Those are actually, if you can't see it because of the light on the stage, one, you should go in there and see the image, right? But there are military men kind of on her head. There are rhinestones across her mouth. Her face is painted. But really kind of dealing with, and this is a longer conversation about Black feminism and ideas of beauty and power and who speaks the truth and who does not, et cetera. This is Willie Cole, who also uses shoes in his work. And it's interesting when he talks about, first Willie used irons. You may be familiar with his prints where he burned images into the surface with an iron. And then he used his son's sneakers, and then water bottles. There are a lot of water bottle installations of his work. And now shoes. And he looks at, again, references to African art and sculpture. But then also when we talk about materials, he actually talks about these in some cases like paintings. Because he would go to thrift shops and see women's shoes, because women's shoes are more often present in thrift shops than men's shoes. I guess we buy way more shoes. And he would say, yes. So what happens is that you wear them differently, right? So each person has different scuffs and discolorations on their shoes. So he takes those. You can get 1,000 white shoes, and they'll all be a different color of white, depending on the manufacturer, how you wore them, if they're brand new or if they're old, and he uses those to construct these kind of large-scale sculptures, which are then can be cast. So you think you're looking at shoes, but then they're actually cast in bronze, which is a very traditional method of art making. And then finally, I think, I have to look, Betty Saar is on your left, and Betty is incredible. She, this is not the piece that's in the exhibition, but Betty Saar uses objects that she collected. And a lot of artists collect a lot of objects to kind of create their work. But I wanted to include these two works, one because, again, we're looking at a way someone has interpreted the Aunt Jemima image. And Betty Saar's liberation of Aunt Jemima was actually what inspired one of the reasons that Renee Cox created this image. So Betty Saar grew up in California. She was familiar with the Watts Tower. She actually saw them going up. She collected a lot of objects. And so for her, like Willie, the object is alive. It has power. It has meaning. And these are objects that we frequently see. So what she's done is to actually transform the very safe Aunt Jemima, who's kind of in the center, right, with the baby, the picture, with a larger Aunt Jemima, three-dimensional Aunt Jemima, who's holding a broom and a shotgun, right? And what does that mean, right? Aunt Jemima's kind of had enough. So Renee saw this image, loved it, and kind of created her own. Now, and what I love about this image is that it's kind of timeless. So if you know about the Afrofuturist movement, right, and this whole idea of Black folks living in the future and superheroes and all that, this is Renee in the center, right? She appears as Rage. That's her superhero character, right? And she's Jamaican, so you have the black and the gold and the black and the green on the bottom part, right? But then red, black, and green is also the Black nationalist flag, right? So she's like rocking the colors. But she also is dressed in, this fabulous outfit, and her accompanying folks, and I'll tell you who those are in a moment, dressed in leather and boots, right? So these are the aesthetics of the revolution all the way. And so she is leading Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, right, towards revolution. Have you guys seen this pose before? Can you guess what traditional painting is actually based on? Classical painting? Yes, Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, right? An image we're totally familiar with. You can look at it and you know exactly what it means and exactly what it's about. And here she is leading these two stereotypes out of your kitchen and potentially into your homes, or somewhere else, right? But this whole idea of transformation and change and ownership and empowerment. And I think those are really important ideas. And in general, because I have to be aware, right? I think this show is really about a lot of things, but one of them is about empowerment because it's something that is freeing to be able to tell your story, right? And insert yourself in a space that has excluded you historically. But then what's also amazing, and we really have to do this, is to really think about the artistic craftsmanship of all of these artists. This is not just about history. This is not just about asserting culture. This is also about the creative process. And we collectively have to be aware and willing to not kind of segregate this show, right, into this space that is just about Blackness or just about revolution or just about forcing yourself to be a part of. It's not that. It's all of those things, but so much more. So that's my take on REMIX. You're welcome.